Imagine for a moment that everything you believe about your own mind is wrong, that your thoughts, your memories, even your personality could be rewritten like code, that somewhere in a sterile government laboratory, scientists in white coats are learning to crack open consciousness itself and rearrange what they find inside. It sounds like science fiction, a paranoid fantasy, the kind of thing you'd dismiss as conspiracy theory madness. Except it happened, and the people who did it kept meticulous records. In 1953, deep within the bureaucratic maze of the Central Intelligence Agency, a new project was born. Its code name was MK Ultra. Its mission was nothing less than mastering the human mind. For the next 20 years, American citizens would become unwitting lab rats in one of the darkest chapters of our government's history. College students, prisoners, mental patients, and ordinary people seeking medical help would have their minds shattered in the name of national security. This is their story. And once you know what really happened, you'll never look at your own government the same way again. The year is 1949. The Cold War has just begun, and America is gripped by a new kind of fear. Not the fear of bombs or bullets, but something far more insidious. Reports are filtering out from behind the Iron Curtain of American prisoners of war returning from Korea with their minds mysteriously altered. Strong-willed soldiers who once would have died before betraying their country are suddenly confessing to war crimes they didn't commit, denouncing capitalism, praising their communist captors. The Pentagon is baffled, the State Department is alarmed, and in the shadowy corridors of the newly formed CIA, a terrifying question takes shape. Have the Soviets discovered how to control the human mind? They called it brainwashing. A word that seems almost quaint now, but in 1950 it represented an existential threat to everything America stood for. If the communists could reprogram a person's thoughts, turn patriots into traitors with some mysterious technique, then no secret was safe. No agent was reliable. The entire foundation of free will that democracy rested on could crumble. The CIA needed answers. More importantly, they needed their own weapons in this new battlefield of the mind. If the Soviets had unlocked the secrets of consciousness, America had to catch up. Fast. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Because to develop these weapons, to learn how to break a mind and rebuild it, they would need test subjects, human beings. And getting volunteers for that kind of experiment? Well, that would require a level of honesty the CIA simply couldn't afford. Enter Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. If this story has a villain, it's him, though he never saw himself that way. A club-footed scientist with a PhD in chemistry, Gottlieb lived a life of strange contradictions. By day, he ran the CIA's Technical Services Division, cooking up poisons and assassination tools. By night, he went home to his cabin in the woods where he drank goat's milk, grew Christmas trees, and square danced with his wife. Gottlieb genuinely believed he was protecting America. In his mind, the work he was about to undertake, however horrific, was a necessary evil in the fight against communism. The ends would justify the means. They always did in the intelligence world. In April 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles gave Gottlieb the green light for a new program. The budget was essentially unlimited. The mandate was breathtakingly broad. Investigate whether it was possible to control human behavior through covert means. And most importantly, the whole thing was to be conducted in absolute secrecy. MK Ultra was born. The MK stood for mind control, spelled with a K in a nod to the German scientists America had recruited after World War II. Scientists who had performed human experiments for the Nazis and were now putting their expertise to work for their former enemies. At first, it seemed like pure research, academic even. Gottlieb began recruiting researchers from universities across the country, psychologists, psychiatrists, chemists, anyone who might hold a piece of the consciousness puzzle. The CIA funneled money through fake foundations, hiding their involvement behind a maze of front organizations. But what they discovered next changed everything. A Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann had recently synthesized a peculiar compound called lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. In tiny doses, mere micrograms, it could completely transform human perception. Colors became sounds. Time folded in on itself. The boundaries of the self dissolved. Here, Gottlieb thought, was the key to the mind they'd been searching for. The CIA began stockpiling LSD with an almost religious fervor. They bought the entire world's supply, terrified that the Soviets might get their hands on it first. And then they began to experiment. The early tests were almost comically naive. CIA employees would volunteer to take LSD in controlled settings, describing their experiences while scientists took notes. It was like a bizarre government-funded drug party, complete with taxpayer money and security clearances. But Gottlieb quickly realized a fundamental problem. People who knew they were taking a mind-altering drug behaved differently than those who didn't. To truly understand LSD's potential as a weapon, they needed to test it on unsuspecting subjects, people who had no idea their morning coffee had been spiked with one of the most powerful psychoactive substances known to man. And this is where MK Ultra crossed the line from questionable to monstrous. The first rule of MK Ultra was simple. Normal ethical constraints didn't apply. Informed consent was a luxury they couldn't afford. After all, how could you test a mind control drug on someone who knew they were being drugged? The very knowledge would contaminate the results, so they got creative. And by creative, I mean they began dosing people without their knowledge or permission. It started small. CIA operatives would slip LSD into each other's drinks at parties, turning what should have been collegial gatherings into impromptu psychological experiments. They called it testing among friends, though friendship seems like the wrong word for people willing to send their colleagues on unexpected trips through the corridors of madness. One agent found himself driving home from a CIA party when the road began melting. The streetlights transformed into writhing serpents. His car became a living creature he was trapped inside. By some miracle, he made it home alive, but the psychological scars lasted years. When he finally learned he'd been dosed by his own colleagues, his trust in the agency, in reality itself, never fully recovered. But Gottlieb wasn't satisfied with testing on willing CIA employees. The program needed more diverse subjects, more extreme conditions. They needed to push the boundaries of human endurance to see where the mind would break. No one realized it yet, but the clock was already ticking toward tragedy. On November 19, 1953, a group of CIA employees gathered at a cabin in rural Maryland for what seemed like a routine retreat. Among them was Dr. Frank Olson, a bacteriologist who worked on the agency's biological warfare program. Olson was a family man, a father of 3, known for his gentle demeanor and scientific brilliance. During the retreat, Gottlieb's deputy slipped LSD into a bottle of Cointreau the men drank after dinner, unaware they were about to become test subjects in their own agency's experiment. Within minutes, the drug took hold. The cabin dissolved into a funhouse of warped perceptions and fractured thoughts. Most of the men rode out their trips and returned to normal. But something in Frank Olson's mind snapped that night. The LSD seemed to have opened a door in his psyche that he couldn't close. In the days that followed, he became withdrawn, paranoid, convinced that his colleagues were plotting against him. His family watched helplessly as the man they loved disappeared into himself. He would sit in silence for hours, then suddenly burst into tears. He talked about mistakes he'd made, sins he couldn't articulate. His wife begged him to tell her what was wrong, but Olson could only shake his head. How could he explain that reality itself had become unreliable, that he no longer trusted his own thoughts? The CIA, recognizing they had a problem, sent Olson to New York to see one of their contracted psychiatrists. But instead of helping, the doctor, who was himself part of MK Ultra, only deepened Olson's paranoia with aggressive questioning and more experimental treatments. On November 28, 1953, 9 days after being dosed, Frank Olson plunged from the 13th floor of New York's Statler Hotel. The CIA claimed he had jumped, a suicide brought on by depression, case closed. His family was told he had suffered a nervous breakdown, nothing more. The LSD experiment was covered up, buried in classified files. But here's the thing about secrets. They have a way of eating at the people who keep them. And MK Ultra was just getting started. If Olson's death gave anyone at the CIA pause, it didn't show. If anything, the program accelerated. Gottlieb interpreted the tragedy not as a warning, but as proof of LSD's power. If it could drive a stable man to suicide in 9 days, imagine what it could do to an enemy agent. The experiment spread like a virus through America's institutions. Universities became unwitting laboratories. Hospitals transformed into testing grounds. The CIA set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York, apartments where prostitutes would bring unsuspecting Johns who would then be dosed with LSD while CIA agents watched through two-way mirrors. They called this particular operation Midnight Climax. Yes, that was its actual code name. Tax dollars at work, funding government agents to watch drugged men have sex with prostitutes in the name of national security. You couldn't make this up if you tried. The San Francisco safe house was run by George Hunter White, a narcotics officer with a reputation for brutality and a taste for dramatics. White would sit on a portable toilet behind the two-way mirror, sipping martinis and taking notes while the test subjects writhed through their altered states. He kept pitchers of chilled martinis in the refrigerator, which he refilled regularly throughout his shifts. I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, White would later write. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest? At first it seemed ordinary until they looked closer. The prostitutes working for Operation Midnight Climax had no idea they were part of a CIA experiment. They thought they were simply being paid extraordinarily well by an eccentric client who wanted to watch. The drinks they served came pre-mixed, delivered by men in suits who never gave their names. Just pour and serve, they were told. Don't ask questions. The victims, because that's what they were, would stumble out hours later, confused and disoriented, with no memory of what had happened. Some would check themselves into hospitals convinced they were losing their minds. Others would simply disappear into the night, carrying the psychological wounds of an experience they couldn't understand or explain. But the CIA wasn't content with random victims in safe houses. They needed more controlled environments, more systematic approaches. They needed institutions where test subjects could be monitored for weeks, months, even years. Enter Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron. If Sidney Gottlieb was the architect of MK Ultra, Cameron was its most enthusiastic contractor. A Scottish-born psychiatrist who ran the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University in Montreal, Cameron had theories about the human mind that were radical even by 1950s standards. He believed that mental illness could be cured by completely erasing a patient's mind and rebuilding their personality from scratch. He called it psychic driving. The CIA called it exactly what they were looking for. With CIA funding laundered through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, Cameron began his experiments. His victims were patients who had come to him seeking help for minor mental health issues. Depression, anxiety, postpartum difficulties. What they got instead was a journey into hell. Cameron would put patients into drug-induced comas for weeks at a time, playing recorded messages on endless loops. "Your mother hates you," repeated thousands of times. Basic statements designed to shatter the patient's sense of self. When they woke, they would be subjected to massive doses of LSD, electroshock therapy at 30 times the normal power, and sensory deprivation that would break even the strongest mind. One patient, Velma Orlikow, had come to Cameron seeking treatment for postpartum depression. She left unable to recognize her own family. Her memories of her children's births were gone. Years of her life simply erased. When she tried to read bedtime stories to her kids, she found she'd forgotten how to read. Another victim, Jean Steele, entered the Allen Memorial Institute as a young mother with mild depression. Cameron's treatments left her incontinent, unable to form new memories, requiring constant care for the rest of her life. Her daughter would later describe finding her mother crawling on the floor, having regressed to an infant-like state. The patients' families were told these were revolutionary new treatments, cutting-edge psychiatry. When patients emerged as hollow shells of their former selves, Cameron would claim they simply hadn't responded well to therapy. No one questioned the great doctor. No one suspected that their loved ones had become unwitting test subjects in a CIA mind control program. But what they discovered next changed everything. While Cameron was destroying minds in Montreal, other MK Ultra researchers were exploring different avenues. At the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, Dr. Harris Isbell had access to a perfect captive population, imprisoned drug addicts. Isbell would offer inmates heroin in exchange for participation in his experiments. Men desperate for a fix would agree to anything. He gave them LSD for days, weeks, sometimes months on end, carefully documenting how long a human mind could withstand constant psychedelic bombardment before breaking completely. One prisoner was kept on LSD for 174 consecutive days. By the end, he couldn't distinguish between his hallucinations and reality. The walls breathed. Voices spoke from empty air. His sense of self had dissolved so completely that he wasn't sure if he existed or was merely a thought in someone else's mind. At psychiatric hospitals across the country, similar scenes played out. Patients who couldn't consent, who had no one to protect them, became fodder for MK Ultra's relentless search for the keys to consciousness. Children as young as 4 years old were given LSD. Terminally ill cancer patients were dosed to see if the drug could ease their fear of death. Each experiment pushed further than the last. Each researcher competed to find new ways to shatter the human psyche. And through it all, Sidney Gottlieb collected data, compiled reports, and searched for the magic formula that would let the CIA control minds at will. They tried everything. Hypnosis combined with drugs, electroshock paired with sensory deprivation, cocktails of pharmaceuticals that had never been tested together. The human mind, they discovered, was remarkably resilient. It could bend, twist, even break, but controlling it, truly controlling it the way they wanted, remained frustratingly out of reach. Years passed. The body count grew. Not just Frank Olson, but others whose deaths were classified, covered up, explained away, suicides that weren't investigated, accidents that seemed too convenient, people who knew too much and said too much disappearing into the night. No one realized it yet, but the clock was already ticking. The program that had operated in absolute secrecy for 2 decades was about to be exposed. By 1973, Sidney Gottlieb could feel the walls closing in. The political climate was changing. Watergate had shattered America's trust in government. Congressional committees were sniffing around the intelligence community, asking uncomfortable questions about CIA activities. The age of unlimited black budgets and zero oversight was coming to an end. Gottlieb knew what historians would find if they ever got access to MK Ultra's files. 20 years of human experimentation, American citizens tortured in their own country, deaths covered up, lives destroyed. It would be the scandal of the century. So he made a decision that would echo through history. He ordered the destruction of all MK Ultra records. In the basement of CIA headquarters, government employees fed box after box of documents into the shredder. Thousands of files detailing experiments, victims, results, all of it turned to confetti. Gottlieb personally oversaw the destruction, making sure nothing survived that could tie the CIA to the horrors of MK Ultra. Or so he thought. In government, as in life, perfection is impossible. A handful of financial documents, invoices, and budget requests had been misfiled with the agency's financial records instead of the operational files. These 7 boxes of paper would lie forgotten in a warehouse for years, a ticking time bomb of evidence that everyone thought had been destroyed. Meanwhile, the first cracks in MK Ultra's wall of secrecy were starting to appear. In 1974, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published a groundbreaking story in the New York Times about CIA domestic spying operations. The article didn't mention MK Ultra specifically, but it opened the floodgates. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know what the CIA had been up to all these years. Congress formed the Church Committee named after Senator Frank Church to investigate intelligence agency abuses. CIA Director William Colby, in a moment of either honesty or calculated damage control, handed over a set of documents that became known as the Family Jewels, a catalog of the agency's most questionable activities. Buried in those papers was the first official acknowledgement of MK Ultra. The revelation hit Washington like a thunderbolt. Mind control experiments on American citizens without their consent? Senators who thought they'd seen everything were genuinely shocked. The Church Committee immediately expanded its investigation, demanding more information about this mysterious program, but when they went looking for documents, they found only ashes. Gottlieb's destruction had been thorough. The CIA claimed all records had been routinely destroyed, painting it as a bureaucratic housekeeping measure rather than a cover-up. For a moment, it seemed like the full truth of MK Ultra might remain buried forever. At first, it seemed ordinary until they looked closer. In 1975, the Rockefeller Commission, another government investigation into CIA activities, stumbled upon something extraordinary. They were investigating Frank Olson's death, which his family had never stopped questioning. The official story of a suicidal jump had never made sense to those who knew him. Under pressure, the CIA finally admitted the truth. Olson had been drugged with LSD 9 days before his death. The admission opened a crack in the wall of secrecy that would never fully close. Olson's family sued the government. During the legal proceedings, more details emerged. The hotel room where Olson died showed signs of a struggle. The window he allegedly jumped from was closed when investigators arrived. Someone had shut it after he fell. A phone call had been made from the room after Olson's death, but before police were notified. President Gerald Ford personally apologized to the Olson family. Congress passed a special bill awarding them $750,000 in compensation. But money couldn't buy back the decades of lies or resurrect the dead, and Frank Olson was just the beginning. As news of MK Ultra spread, victims began coming forward. Velma Orlikow read about the CIA experiments in a newspaper and realized with dawning horror that Dr. Cameron's treatment had been part of a government program. She contacted other former patients, and together they began piecing together the truth of what had been done to them. The Canadian government launched its own investigation. What they found at the Allen Memorial Institute defied belief. Patient records showing massive doses of LSD, electroshock therapy that exceeded all medical guidelines, experiments that belonged in a horror movie rather than a hospital. But the real bombshell came in 1977. John Marks, a former State Department official turned investigative journalist, had filed a Freedom of Information Act request for any remaining MK Ultra documents. The CIA, confident that Gottlieb had destroyed everything, approved the request. Then someone found those 7 misfiled boxes. Suddenly, the CIA faced a dilemma. The documents had been officially requested. Destroying them now would be illegal. Reluctantly, they released 20,000 pages of MK Ultra financial records to Marks. What those documents revealed changed everything we thought we knew about our government's capacity for evil. The financial records were like a roadmap to horror. Each invoice, each budget request told a story of human experimentation hidden behind bureaucratic language. Payments to universities for behavioral research, funds transferred to hospitals for special procedures, checks written to prisons for volunteer studies. John Marks spent months decoding the paper trail, cross-referencing locations with dates, matching code names to real institutions. What emerged was a picture of a program far larger than anyone had imagined. MKUltra hadn't been a single project but an umbrella for 149 sub-projects, each one pushing the boundaries of ethical research in its own unique way. There were experiments in hypnosis at major universities where students were put into trances and given post-hypnotic suggestions to see if they could be made to commit acts against their will. Researchers discovered that while hypnotized subjects wouldn't do things they found morally reprehensible while conscious, the definition of morally reprehensible became remarkably flexible under the right conditions. There were sensory deprivation studies where volunteers, though how voluntary any participation in MKUltra really was remains questionable, were locked in dark, soundproof chambers for days. Deprived of any external stimuli, the human mind began to manufacture its own reality. Subjects reported vivid hallucinations, out-of-body experiences, and a complete loss of temporal awareness. Some emerged believing days had passed when it had only been hours. Others thought mere minutes had elapsed during days of isolation. The documents revealed contracts with pharmaceutical companies to develop new psychoactive compounds. The CIA wasn't content with LSD alone. They wanted an entire arsenal of mind-altering drugs, some that would make subjects more compliant, others that would enhance aggression. Chemicals that could erase specific memories while leaving others intact. One particularly chilling document outlined research into biological radio communication. Scientists were attempting to find ways to transmit thoughts directly into the human brain using radio waves. The experiments failed, but not for lack of trying. Test subjects reported hearing voices, feeling inexplicable emotions, and experiencing thoughts they insisted weren't their own. But here's where the story takes another dark turn, because the financial records only told part of the story. They showed where money went, but not always what happened when it got there. For every documented experiment, investigators suspected there were others that left no paper trail at all. Marx published his findings in a book called The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. The public finally had a comprehensive look at MKUltra's scope. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Congressional hearings were demanded, lawsuits were filed. The CIA found itself in the uncomfortable position of having to defend the indefensible. During the 1977 Senate hearings on MKUltra, some of the most dramatic testimony came from the victims themselves. They told their stories to a packed committee room. Their words carried live on television to a horrified nation. One woman described being a young mother seeking help for depression and leaving the hospital unable to remember her children's names. A former soldier testified about being given LSD without his knowledge during what he thought was a routine medical exam, then spending years convinced he was losing his mind. Patient after patient detailed treatments that sounded more like torture than therapy. But perhaps the most chilling testimony came from the researchers themselves. When asked how they could justify experimenting on unwitting subjects, many seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. It was for national security, they explained, as if that answered everything. The Cold War demanded sacrifices. Individual rights were a luxury when facing an existential threat. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, called out of retirement to testify, was unrepentant. Yes, mistakes had been made. Yes, people had been hurt. But the research had been necessary. The Soviets were conducting their own mind control experiments. America couldn't afford to fall behind. When pressed about specific victims, about Frank Olson and the ruined lives left in MKUltra's wake, Gottlieb's memory became conveniently vague. No one realized it yet, but the clock was already ticking toward more revelations. As the hearings progressed, investigators made a disturbing discovery. MKUltra hadn't operated in isolation. It was part of a larger network of CIA programs exploring the limits of human consciousness and control. Projects with names like Artichoke and Bluebird had preceded MKUltra, conducting similar experiments with similar disregard for human rights. Even more troubling, some of these programs appeared to still be operational. When senators pressed CIA officials about current mind control research, the answers were evasive. National security prevented full disclosure. Certain methods and sources had to remain classified. The same arguments that had protected MK Ultra for 20 years were being deployed again. The hearings ended with more questions than answers. The CIA admitted to past wrongdoing but insisted those days were over. New oversight mechanisms were in place. The cowboys of the Cold War had been reined in. Trust us, they said. It won't happen again. But trust, once shattered, is not easily rebuilt. And for the victims of MK Ultra, the damage was irreversible. The lawsuits began almost immediately after the hearings. Velma Orlikow and 8 other Canadian victims of Dr. Cameron's experiments filed suit against the CIA in 1980. The legal battle would drag on for 8 years, the government deploying every delaying tactic in its arsenal. The CIA's defense was as predictable as it was callous. National security prevented them from discussing classified programs. When that failed, they argued the statute of limitations had expired. When that failed, they claimed they couldn't be held responsible for the actions of independent contractors like Cameron. But the victims persisted. They formed support groups, sharing their fragmented memories and trying to piece together what had been done to them. Many discovered that the friends they'd made during their hospital stays had been fellow victims, the woman in the next bed, the man down the hall, all of them unwitting test subjects in the same monstrous experiment. The stories that emerged during depositions were heartbreaking. Women who had sought help for postpartum depression and lost the ability to care for their children. Men who had entered hospitals with minor anxiety and left unable to work. Their professional skills erased along with their memories. Entire families destroyed by a government program they never knew existed. In 1988, the CIA finally settled, paying out $750,000 to be divided among the Canadian victims. It was a pittance compared to what they'd lost, but it represented something more valuable than money: acknowledgement. The United States government was officially admitting it had tortured Canadian citizens in the name of research, but what they discovered next changed everything. As more victims came forward and more documents surfaced, a pattern began to emerge. MK Ultra hadn't just been about mind control. It had been about perfecting interrogation techniques. The sensory deprivation, the drugs, the psychological torture, all of it had been field tested on unwitting civilians before being deployed in the real world. The techniques developed in MK Ultra's laboratories showed up in CIA interrogation manuals used in Latin America and Southeast Asia. The enhanced interrogation methods that would later shock the world at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay had their roots in the experiments of the 1950s and 60s. The torture wasn't an aberration, it was the point. Former CIA operatives, protected by the veil of retirement and the passage of time, began to talk more freely about what they'd witnessed. One described watching subjects being given paralytic drugs that left them fully conscious, but unable to move or speak, trapped in their own bodies while researchers tested their psychological responses to complete helplessness. Another recalled experiments combining psychoactive drugs with extreme temperatures, seeing how long a human could endure having their body temperature artificially raised or lowered while under the influence of LSD. The more investigators dug, the more connections they found. MK Ultra tentacles reached into every corner of American society. Famous writers and artists had been unwitting subjects. Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, had volunteered for LSD experiments at a VA hospital, not knowing he was part of MK Ultra. The Grateful Dead's early acid tests were connected to the program. The counterculture of the 1960s, it turned out, had been partially funded by the CIA. The irony was breathtaking. The agency trying to develop mind control had accidentally helped launch a social revolution that questioned all forms of authority, including theirs. The hippies dropping acid at Woodstock were using the same drug the CIA had hoped would unlock the secrets of consciousness. In 1994, a new bombshell dropped. Frank Olson's body was exhumed at the request of his family. The second autopsy revealed injuries inconsistent with a fall from a window, injuries that suggested Olson had been struck on the head before going through that hotel window. the Manhattan District Attorney's Office opened a homicide investigation. Though it was ultimately closed without charges, too much time had passed, too many witnesses were dead, it raised the terrifying possibility that Olson hadn't committed suicide at all, that perhaps he had been murdered to keep him quiet about what he knew. Olson's son Eric spent decades investigating his father's death, uncovering evidence that Frank Olson had been deeply troubled by his work on biological weapons and had been considering leaving the CIA. Had he become a security risk? Had his bad trip on LSD been not an accident, but a warning? Or worse, an assassination disguised as an experiment gone wrong? We may never know the truth. But the questions themselves reveal the depth of trust MK Ultra destroyed. Once a government shows itself capable of experimenting on its own citizens, of lying about it for decades, of destroying evidence and intimidating witnesses, every death becomes suspicious. Every suicide might be murder. Every accident could be deliberate. At first it seemed ordinary until they looked closer. Today, the Allen Memorial Institute still stands on the slopes of Montreal's Mount Royal. It's been renovated, modernized, turned into just another psychiatric facility, but some of Cameron's former patients say they can't drive past it without feeling physically ill. The walls that witnessed their torture still stand. The rooms where their minds were broken have been repainted, but not exorcised. Most of the MK Ultra researchers are dead now. Sidney Gottlieb passed away in 1999, taking many secrets to his grave. He spent his final years living quietly, still maintaining that his work had been necessary, even noble. In his obituary, the New York Times called him the man who brought LSD to the CIA. It seemed an almost quaint description for someone who had overseen decades of human torture. Dr. Cameron died in 1967 hiking in the Adirondack Mountains. He never faced justice for what he did to his patients, never had to look Velma Orlikow or John Steele in the eye and explain why he destroyed their minds in the name of science. His colleagues eulogized him as a pioneer in psychiatry. His victims had other words for what he was, but the legacy of MK Ultra extends far beyond the individuals who ran it. The program fundamentally altered the relationship between Americans and their government. It proved that the institutions we trust to protect us are capable of viewing us as expendable test subjects, that national security can be used to justify any atrocity, that the people we elect to represent us will look the other way when the CIA decides to play God with human consciousness. The Church Committee, in its final report, called MK Ultra a monument to the conceit that the secret intelligence agencies can do whatever they want, without supervision or accountability. But monuments usually commemorate something we want to remember. MK Ultra is more like a scar, evidence of a wound that will never fully heal. And here's the truly terrifying part. We only know what we know because of accidents. A misfiled box of documents, a few researchers who kept personal notes, victims who lived to tell their tales. For every experiment we've uncovered, how many remain buried? For every victim who came forward, how many suffered in silence and took their stories to the grave? The CIA assures us that MK Ultra ended in 1973, that the cowboy days are over, that modern oversight prevents such abuses. But then we learn about enhanced interrogation at black sites, about psychologists helping design torture programs, about detainees being subjected to techniques that look remarkably similar to what was done in those Montreal hospital rooms. The names change. The justifications evolve. But the fundamental question remains the same. How far is too far in the name of national security? When does the cure become worse than the disease? At what point do we become the very evil we claim to be fighting against? No one realized it yet. But the clock was already ticking. Because every generation faces these questions anew. Every crisis brings calls for extraordinary measures. Every threat becomes an excuse to chip away at the boundaries between what we can do and what we should do. The victims of MK Ultra paid the price for our collective naivety. They believed their government would protect them, that doctors would first do no harm, that there were lines even the CIA wouldn't cross. They were wrong on all counts. Today, when we debate surveillance and privacy, when we argue about the balance between security and freedom, when we wonder how much power to give our intelligence agencies, we would do well to remember MK Ultra, to remember Frank Olson falling from that hotel window, to remember Velma Orlikow unable to recognize her own children, to remember all the nameless victims whose minds were shattered on the altar of the Cold War. Because the techniques change, but the temptation remains constant. There will always be those who believe that the end just